Spring 1945. A prisoner of war camp somewhere in occupied Germany. The convoy rolls through the gates just after dawn. Dust rises from the tires. Engine noise echoes off the barbed wire fences. Inside the compound, hundreds of women in tattered auxiliary uniforms stand behind the wire, watching. They are German. They are prisoners now. Their war is over. But what stops them cold isn't the arrival of more troops. It's the driver. She wears an American uniform, olive drab, boots lace tight. Her hair is pinned beneath a regulation cap. She shifts gears with practiced ease, guides the 2.5-ton truck around the muddy ruts, and brings it to a smooth stop near the command tent. She climbs out, checks the manifest, walks away. The women behind the wire don't move. They don't speak. They stare, because everything they were taught, everything they believed about women, about war, about the natural order of the world, just drove past them in a US Army truck for more than a decade before the war. The regimes of Germany, Italy, and Japan built their power on rigid definitions of gender. In Nazi Germany, the ideal woman was defined by 3 words: Kinder, Couch, Kirk children, kitchen, church. The state glorified motherhood as the highest duty. Women were awarded medals for bearing children. The Cross of Honor of the German mother came in bronze, silver, and gold, depending on how many sons and daughters a woman produced for the Reich. The Nazi Party disbanded women's professional organizations. It pushed women out of universities, out of government positions, out of public life. Propaganda posters showed mothers cradling infants, tending gardens, standing beside strong-jawed soldiers. The message was clear: men fight, women nurture. The roles were biological, immutable, sacred. In Imperial Japan, the ideology was similar but older. Women served the family, the household, the emperor, but always from within domestic walls. The concept of Ryosari Kenbo, good wife, wise mother, shaped expectations for centuries. Women could work in factories when the war demanded it, but they did so as an extension of maternal duty, not as individuals with agency. They were never soldiers, never drivers, never operators of machines meant for war. Italy under Mussolini echoed the same themes. Fascist doctrines celebrated the rural mother, the guardian of tradition, the keeper of Italy's blood and soil. Women who sought independence or careers were seen as corrupted by liberal decadence, by the weak democracies of the West. By 1939, these beliefs weren't just propaganda. They were law. They were education. They were the framework through which millions of women understood themselves and their place in the world. And then the United States entered the war. America had its own resistance to women in uniform. Before Pearl Harbor, the idea of women serving in the military, even in support roles, was met with skepticism, mockery, and outright hostility. Congressmen questioned whether women could handle discipline. Military leaders worried about morale, propriety, scandal. Newspapers ran cartoons showing women in oversized helmets, stumbling with rifles, crying over broken nails. But December 7, 1940, one changed the calculus. The attack on Pearl Harbor didn't just draw America into war, it exposed how desperately the nation needed every available hand. 16 million men would eventually serve. That left factories understaffed, farms unworked, and critical military logistics roles unfilled. The military didn't have enough drivers, didn't have enough radio operators, clerks, mechanics, or codebreakers. Ideology had to bend to necessity. In May 1942, Congress established the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, later renamed the Women's Army Corps, the WWII. The Navy followed with WWIS, women accepted for volunteer emergency service. The Coast Guard created the SPARS. The Marines formed their own women's reserve. At first, recruitment was slow. Families hesitated. Churches preached caution. But the posters went up anyway. Women in sharp uniforms, eyes forward, hands steady. Release a man for combat. The slogans read. By 1943, women were driving trucks across Europe. They were repairing engines in motor pools from England to the Philippines. They operated switchboards that coordinated airstrikes. They handled classified documents, decoded enemy transmissions, and flew planes not in combat, but ferrying bombers from factories to air bases, a job that freed male pilots for war zones. The 6,888th Central Postal Battalion, composed entirely of black women, sorted millions of pieces of mail in warehouses across Europe, ensuring soldiers received letters from home, sometimes the only thread keeping them tethered to sanity. These women didn't carry rifles into battle, but they were soldiers. They wore the uniform. They followed orders. They saluted officers and stood at attention. They fixed what broke, drove what needed moving, and kept the vast machinery of war running when it would have otherwise ground to a halt. And when the Axis powers finally collapsed, when their soldiers and auxiliaries became prisoners, those women saw something they had been told was impossible. The women behind the wire had been shaped by years of state messaging. German auxiliary Nachrichtenhelfer, communication helpers, or Stabshelferin, staff assistants had volunteered or been conscripted into roles that supported the Wehrmacht. They answered phones. They typed orders. They operated radios in bunkers, far from the front. But they never drove military vehicles. They never wore combat boots or handled tools meant for machines of war. That was men's work. The state had drawn the line clearly. From the time they were young, these women had been taught through school curriculum, through Hitler Youth programs for girls, the Bund Deutsche Mägdel, that femininity meant sacrifice, obedience, and support. Strength was something men possessed. Independence was a Western poison. The posters on their classroom walls didn't show women driving trucks. They showed women holding infants, standing in fields of wheat, waiting for their husbands to return, even in the desperate final years of the war, when Germany scraped the bottom of its manpower reserves. Women were not given the roles American women held. They were stretched thin, yes, working in factories, running farms, keeping cities alive under bombardment, but always within the boundaries the regime had set. They were told this was natural, biological. Right. So, when they saw an American woman climb into the cab of a military truck, start the engine with confidence, and drive it like she'd done it 1,000 times before, the dissonance was immediate. It wasn't just surprising, it was destabilizing. It challenged the foundation of everything they had been taught to believe about themselves, about men, about order. The women driving those trucks hadn't been handed their roles easily. They had fought for them not with weapons, but with persistence, competence, and sheer necessity. When the Women's Army Corps began recruiting drivers for the Motor Transport Corps, the standards were high. Women had to pass the same mechanical aptitude tests as men. They had to demonstrate they could change a tire, check fluid levels, navigate by map, and handle vehicles weighing several tons on roads torn apart by war. Training was rigorous. At bases like Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, women learned to drive 2.5-ton cargo trucks, do sand-a-halves, in all weather, on dirt roads, in convoys. They studied engine repair, learned to troubleshoot carburetors and transmissions, and were tested on their ability to keep a vehicle running under pressure. Those who passed were assigned to motor pools in North Africa, England, France, and the Pacific. By 1945, more than 150,000 women were serving in the WWII alone. Thousands more served in the Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard. They weren't symbols. They weren't morale props. They were doing the work. Staff Sergeant Charity Adams commanded the 6,888th Postal Battalion, 855 women who processed mail in bombed-out warehouses in Birmingham, England, and later in Rouen and Paris. Captain Charity Edna Adams Early became the first black woman to be commissioned as an officer in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. These women knew they were being watched. They knew that every mistake would be used as evidence that women couldn't handle the job. So they didn't make mistakes. They showed up early. They stayed late. They proved, day after day, that competence had nothing to do with gender. The decision to deploy women in logistics and transport roles wasn't ideological. It was mathematical. By mid-1943, the US military was operating on multiple fronts: North Africa, Italy, the Pacific Islands, and preparing for the invasion of France. Every front required supply lines. Every supply line needed drivers, mechanics, and coordinators. The number of men available for these roles was finite, and every man reassigned from a motor pool to an infantry division increased combat strength where it mattered most. General Dwight D. Eisenhower recognized this early. In North Africa, he approved the deployment of WAC units to handle clerical work, communications, and vehicle maintenance. The results were immediate. Efficiency improved. Paper backlogs disappeared. Vehicles stayed operational longer. When the invasion of Europe began, Eisenhower requested more women. By the end of the war, he would publicly state that the women under his command had performed every type of duty, and that their service was invaluable. The numbers supported him. A single WAC motor pool unit could free up 50 to 100 men for frontline assignments. Multiply that across dozens of bases, across multiple theaters, and the impact became strategic. Women weren't just helping, they were force multipliers. They allowed the Allies to maintain operational tempo without hemorrhaging combat strength. In the Pacific, women from the Army Nurse Corps drove ambulances through jungles under fire. Navy waves operated logistics centers that coordinated ship movements across thousands of miles of ocean. These weren't safe, comfortable assignments. They were essential, dangerous, and exhausting. The women who performed them understood that their work kept soldiers alive, kept units supplied, and kept the war machine moving forward. For the Axis POWs, the sight of American women in uniform wasn't just unexpected, it was psychologically disorienting. Propaganda had told them the Allies were weak, decadent, morally collapsed. The image of Western democracy was one of chaos, where traditional values had been abandoned and social order had disintegrated. Women in trousers, driving trucks, giving orders. This was supposed to be evidence of decline, not strength. But the women they saw weren't weak. They weren't confused or struggling. They moved with purpose. They understood their machinery. They carried themselves with the same discipline as male soldiers. The propaganda had lied, or at least failed to capture the truth. And if the propaganda had lied about this, what else had been false? Interrogation records from POW camps occasionally captured these moments. A German auxiliary, questioned about her impressions of American forces, mentioned her shock at seeing female officers issuing orders to male soldiers, something unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. A Japanese civilian, held in a camp in the Pacific, reportedly asked an interpreter if the American women were forced to work, unable to comprehend that they had volunteered. This wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a clash of worldviews. The Axis powers had built their identities on hierarchy, on fixed roles, on the belief that strength came from rigid structure. The presence of American women in uniform suggested that strength could come from flexibility, from using all available resources, from trusting individuals regardless of gender. It was a quiet form of ideological warfare, not planned, not designed, but devastating nonetheless. The women driving those trucks didn't know they were shattering beliefs. They were just doing their jobs. But every time a power saw them, another crack formed in the foundation of everything they had been taught. The German auxiliaries arrived in groups of 30 or 40, transported from frontline capture points to processing centers behind Allied lines. They had been marching 4 days, sleeping in barns and abandoned schoolhouses, eating from field kitchens run by soldiers who spoke languages they didn't understand. They were exhausted, disoriented. The war they had served was collapsing around them, and they had become part of the wreckage. The camp itself was a grid of tents and temporary structures surrounded by wire fencing. Guards stood at intervals, rifles slung, watching without malice. There was no brutality here, no cruelty, just the mechanical efficiency of a system processing thousands of prisoners every week. The women were registered, photographed, assigned tent numbers. They were told where to line up for food, where to wash, where to wait for further orders. And then they saw her, a staff sergeant in the Women's Army Corps, walking across the muddy compound with a clipboard under her arm. She wore the same uniform as the male soldiers: olive drab trousers, field jacket, helmet liner tucked under her belt. Her boots were caked with the same mud. Her posture was the same, straight-backed, purposeful, unbothered by the weight of the pack on her shoulders. She stopped at a jeep parked near the command tent, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. One of the German women, a former Nachrichten felon, who had spent 2 years operating radio equipment in a bunker outside Berlin, stood frozen at the wire. She watched the sergeant shift into gear, maneuver the jeep around a supply truck, and drive toward the main gate. The woman turned to the prisoner beside her, a younger auxiliary who had worked in a field hospital. "Did you see that?" she whispered in German. The younger woman nodded slowly. Her face was pale. They let women drive military vehicles. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that felt like a rupture. Everything they had been told about the weakness of democracies, about the collapse of gender roles in the West, about how the Allies were losing because they had abandoned natural order, suddenly felt hollow. This wasn't chaos. This was organization. This wasn't weakness. This was confidence. Over the next several days, the sightings continued. A motor pool operated by WWII mechanics, women in coveralls changing tires and adjusting carburetors, a communications officer, a woman, issuing orders to male subordinates who saluted her without hesitation, a supply convoy rolling through the camp, half the drivers female, handling the heavy trucks with the same ease as their male counterparts. The German auxiliaries talked among themselves in low voices, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught. Some clung to old explanations. Maybe these women were exceptions, anomalies, perhaps criminals or social outcasts forced into labor. But those theories crumbled quickly. The American women were disciplined, respected. They moved through the camp with authority. One afternoon, a lieutenant from the WWII entered the women's section of the camp to conduct interviews for processing. She carried herself like an officer. She asked questions in clear, formal English, which a translator relayed in German. She recorded answers on official forms. She didn't apologize for her presence. She didn't explain herself. When she left, one of the older German women, a former staff assistant who had worked directly under Wehrmacht officers, sat down on her bunk and stared at the tent wall. "We were told they couldn't do this," she said quietly. "We were told women couldn't be soldiers." Another prisoner, younger, sharper, replied, "They're not soldiers. They don't carry rifles." The older woman shook her head. "Neither did we." The breaking point came not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small, undeniable realities. Every day brought new evidence. A woman directing traffic at the camp entrance, whistle in hand, waving through convoys with the same authority as any MP. A female medic treating wounded German soldiers in the camp infirmary, her hands steady, her orders clear. A WWII supply clerk processing requests, stamping documents, managing inventory with cold efficiency. The Japanese prisoners, mostly civilian women, and the handful of military nurses captured in the Philippines and Okinawa experienced the same shock, but through a different cultural lens. In their world, women had always worked, but never in positions of visible authority over men. The sight of an American woman wearing sergeant stripes, giving orders to male privates, felt like a violation of cosmic order. One nurse, interviewed years later, recalled believing at first that the American military must be desperately short of men, that only catastrophic losses could explain why women were filling these roles. But the prisoners could see the American soldiers. They were young, healthy, well-fed. There was no desperation here, no collapse. The Allies weren't losing, they were winning. And they were winning with women driving their trucks. In one documented exchange, a German auxiliary asked her American guard through a translator why the women were allowed to serve. The guard, a corporal from Ohio, seemed confused by the question. "They volunteered," he said simply. "Same as anyone else." The auxiliary pressed further. "Weren't the men ashamed? Didn't it dishonor them to have women doing men's work?" The corporal shrugged. "They're doing their jobs. We're doing ours. The war doesn't care who drives the truck as long as the supplies get where they need to go." It was the pragmatism of that answer that unsettled her most. There was no ideology in it, no grand philosophy, just function, just results. The Americans had looked at the problem to many tasks, not enough hands, and solved it by using everyone capable of helping. It was efficient, logical, and it worked. By late April, as Germany's surrender approached, the camps filled with more prisoners. Among them were women who had served closer to the front, who had seen the final desperate months of the war. They arrived hollow-eyed, traumatized, expecting harsh treatment. Instead, they found order. They found food. They found American women in uniform processing their intake, recording their names, assigning them bunks. One evening, a group of German auxiliaries sat outside their tents as the sun set over the French countryside. They watched a WWII convoy roll past 10 trucks, 7 of them driven by women. The vehicles moved in perfect formation. The drivers didn't struggle with the heavy steering. They didn't hesitate at turns. They had done this 1,000 times before. They're better at it than some of our men were, one of the prisoners said quietly. No one disagreed. That night, in tents across multiple camps, similar conversations took place. Women who had been raised to believe in immutable gender roles, who had been taught that their greatest strength was obedience and nurture, confronted the reality that another nation had simply chosen differently, and that choice hadn't weakened them. It had made them stronger. The ideology didn't collapse all at once. Beliefs that deep don't shatter in a day. But cracks formed, doubts crept in, and in the silence of those camps, as the war died around them, thousands of women began to question everything they had been told about what women could and couldn't do. The Americans didn't lecture them, didn't try to convert them. They just kept working, kept driving, kept proving, through action alone, that the old certainties were lies. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, more than 350,000 American women had served in uniform across all branches of the military. They had driven more than 50 million miles in military vehicles. They had maintained fleets of trucks, jeeps, and ambulances that kept supply lines open, from Normandy to the Rhine, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. They had operated communication networks that coordinated airstrikes, naval movements, and ground operations. They had sorted mountains of mail, decoded enemy transmissions, and kept the administrative machinery of war functioning when it would have otherwise collapsed under its own weight. The statistics were undeniable. The WWII alone had freed more than 200,000 men for combat duty. General Douglas MacArthur, initially skeptical of women in uniform, called them my best soldiers after seeing their performance in the Pacific. General George Marshall stated publicly that the war could not have been won without them. These weren't gestures of politeness. They were assessments based on operational reality. The prisoners who witnessed this went home to nations that had been shattered. Germany was divided, occupied, its cities reduced to rubble. Japan was devastated by firebombing and atomic weapons, its empire dissolved. In both countries, the old certainties about strength, about order, about the natural roles of men and women no longer held the same power. Reality had disproven them. Some of the former auxiliaries never spoke about what they saw. They returned to their families, rebuilt their lives, and kept their doubts private. Others carried the memory forward. A few, in interviews conducted decades later, admitted that seeing American women in uniform had been the first crack in their belief in the ideology they had served. It didn't convert them overnight, but it planted a question. If everything they had been told about women was wrong, what else had been a lie? In the years that followed, both Germany and Japan would slowly, painfully, reshape their societies. Women would enter universities again. They would work in professions that had been close to them. They would vote, own property, make choices that their mother's generation had been denied. The change didn't come from the example of American women alone, but that example had been visible, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. For the American women who served, the return home was complicated. The war ended, and the nation wanted its soldiers back, but mostly its male soldiers. The women were thanked, honored in parades, and then quietly pushed aside. The WWII was reduced in size. Motor pools were reassigned to men. Many of the women who had driven trucks across Europe who had kept the machinery of war running, found themselves back in kitchens and typing poles, their service treated as a temporary aberration rather than a permanent shift. The G-Bill offered education and housing benefits, but cultural pressure steered women away from claiming them fully. Magazines that had once celebrated Rosie the Riveter now ran articles about the importance of women returning to domestic life. The message was clear: the emergency was over, and so was the need for women in non-traditional roles. But something had changed. The women who served didn't forget what they had done. They had proven to themselves, to their commanders, to the enemy, that they were capable of more than the culture had allowed. Many went on to careers, to activism, to lives that didn't fit the narrow scripts they had been handed before the war. They became engineers, doctors, lawyers, business owners. They raised daughters who never doubted that women could drive trucks, fix engines, or give orders. By the 1970s, when the military finally began integrating women into permanent roles beyond nursing and clerical work, many of the women who pushed for those changes were veterans of World War II. They remembered what it felt like to be told they couldn't do something, and then to do it anyway. They remembered the looks on the faces of prisoners who couldn't believe what they were seeing. In 2022, the US Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the women who served in World War II, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. By then, most of them were gone. The youngest were in their 90s. The medal came 77 years late, but the legacy didn't wait for recognition. It had already spread. The daughters and granddaughters of those women grew up in a world where the question wasn't whether women could serve, it was only a matter of how far the doors would open. The shock that Axis prisoners felt in 1945, the disbelief that women could operate machines and wear uniforms and hold authority, became a relic of a discarded past. The women who drove those trucks didn't set out to change the world. They set out to win a war. But in doing so, they dismantled an ideology more thoroughly than any bomb ever could. There is a photograph, black and white, taken somewhere in France in the spring of 1945. It shows a WWII motor pool sergeant standing beside her truck, arms crossed, face calm. In the background, blurred but visible, are figures behind a wire fence, prisoners, watching. The photographer didn't capture their expressions. We don't know what they were thinking in that moment, but we know what they saw: a woman in uniform, confident and competent, standing in a role they had been told was impossible. War reveals what societies believe about strength. The Axis powers believed strength came from hierarchy, from fixed roles, from keeping people in their designated places. The Allies imperfectly, reluctantly, often only out of necessity, discovered that strength could come from flexibility, from using every resource, from trusting competence over tradition. The women who drove those trucks didn't shatter the ideology of their enemies with speeches or arguments. They shattered it by existing, by showing up, by doing the work and doing it well. They proved that the boundaries drawn around gender were not natural laws, they were choices. And choices can be unmade. Decades later, the shock those prisoners felt seems almost quaint. Women drive trucks. Women serve in uniform. Women command. The question is no longer whether they can, it's why anyone ever believed they couldn't. The answer lies in that moment, in those camps, in the silence of realization, because belief is fragile when confronted with reality, and reality, in the end, always wins.